I don't care about your sister.
Aveline Rourke said, and meant every word. She fired him on a Tuesday afternoon without looking up from her phone. Rowan Calder walked out of her life the same way he had entered it, quietly, without a scene. He was just a bodyguard, a poor one at that. She told herself she wouldn't think about him again. She was wrong. Because nearly a month later, Aveline was blindfolded, zip-tied to a chair in an abandoned warehouse, and the only person coming for her was the man she had thrown away. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. Stories like this one drop every week, and you don't want to miss what comes next. The morning Senator Graham Rourke decided his daughter needed a bodyguard. Aveline was standing in the kitchen of their Georgetown estate, in silk pajamas, arguing with the housekeeper about the temperature of her coffee. She was 26 years old, had never once taken public transportation, and considered being told what to do a personal offense. When her father summoned her to his study and introduced her to the man who would be following her everywhere from that point forward, her first reaction was not fear or gratitude, it was irritation. Rowan Calder stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, still in the way that people are still when they've learned how to wait without fidgeting. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, wearing a dark suit that fit him well, but clearly wasn't new. His eyes moved around the room when Aveline walked in, not to her face first, but to the doorframe, the windows, the corners. It was the kind of habit you didn't pick up in a classroom. Graham made the introduction with the quiet weight of a man who had already made up his mind. "Rowan will be with you whenever you're outside this house," Graham said. "After what happened last month, I'm not taking chances." The attack on Graham 3 weeks earlier had been brief and brutal, with 2 men outside his parking garage. A struggle, a broken rib. The men were arrested, but whoever sent them was not. Graham had aged 10 years in those 3 weeks, and for the first time in her life, Aveline had seen something close to fear in his eyes. She looked at Rowan. Rowan looked back at her, calm and unhurried, and said nothing. "He doesn't look like much," Aveline said to her father, as if Rowan were not standing 5 feet away. Graham's expression tightened. "He's the best I could find," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. What Aveline didn't know was what Rowan's file actually contained. A decade of active duty, 2 tours overseas, medals he'd never mentioned in the interview. He had left the military 18 months earlier, not because he wanted to, but because his younger sister Elodie had been diagnosed with leukemia, and someone had to be there. He had taken every security contract he could find, since then keeping the work quiet and the schedule brutal, because the hospital bills did not stop arriving. None of that changed how Aveline treated him. He was a shadow she hadn't asked for, and she made sure he knew it. The first week was a study in deliberate discomfort. Aveline moved through her days at a pace designed to be inconvenient, last-minute itinerary changes, long lunches at restaurants with no parking, impromptu shopping trips that lasted 3 hours and ended with nothing purchased. Rowan followed without complaint. He stood outside fitting rooms. He waited in lobbies. He opened car doors she hadn't asked him to open, and positioned himself 2 steps behind her at gallery openings where she was trying to have private conversations. Every time she turned around, he was there, quiet, watchful, and completely unrattled. "You're like a shadow that didn't get the memo, it's not wanted," she told him one morning outside a coffee shop, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. A few heads turned. Rowan picked up her coffee from the counter where she'd forgotten it and held it out to her without a word. She snatched it from his hand and walked out. Behind her she heard nothing, no sigh, no muttered comment, no reaction at all. That was somehow more infuriating than if he had argued back. She tried other approaches. She introduced him at a dinner party as my babysitter, courtesy of my very nervous father, and watched the table for a reaction. Rowan stood near the wall and nodded politely at the guests who glanced at him, as though he had been called far worse and found it mildly amusing. At a charity event, she told the host that her hired decorative plant would need somewhere to stand and gestured at Rowan. The host laughed nervously. Rowan smiled, actually smiled, and said, "Anywhere near the exit works fine." She hadn't expected that. the small, dry humor sitting just beneath the surface of all that discipline. It annoyed her in a different way than the silence did. Callum Voss entered the picture in the second week, which complicated everything. Aveline had been seeing him loosely for several months, dinners, events, the kind of relationship that existed mostly in public and hadn't yet been defined in private. He was 34, successful, in the way that people who inherited good companies and made them slightly better often were, and Graham approved of him for reasons that were more financial than personal. Callum was charming when he wanted to be, and impatient when he wasn't, and lately he had been impatient more often than not. The problem was that Rowan made Callum nervous, and Callum's nervousness made him mean. At a dinner early in the third week, Callum spent the better part of an hour finding small ways to remind everyone at the table that Rowan was the help, asking him to fetch things, making comments about staff, with a particular emphasis that wasn't accidental. Rowan absorbed it without expression. Aveline said nothing. She told herself it was because she agreed with the sentiment. She didn't examine that too closely. What she noticed without meaning to was the way Callum's manner shifted whenever the Rourke family business came up in conversation. He was relaxed about almost everything until someone mentioned the company, and then something in him went careful and precise. At that same dinner, Aveline had mentioned offhandedly that her father was considering an internal audit of the company's overseas accounts, and Callum had gone very still for exactly 2 seconds before laughing it off and redirecting the conversation. It was nothing, she told herself. He was probably just bored by business talk at dinner. Rowan had noticed too. She could tell by the way his gaze moved to Callum and stayed there a beat longer than usual. But Aveline wasn't interested in what Rowan noticed. The confrontation came on a Tuesday. Aveline had arranged to meet Callum at a restaurant near her office, lunch, casual. Nothing that should have required a security detail hovering nearby. She told Rowan to wait in the car. He told her that wasn't something he could agree to. They had a short, clipped argument in the parking lot that ended with Rowan following her inside and taking a table near the wall where he could see the full room. Aveline sat down across from Callum, who spotted Rowan immediately and whose jaw tightened. The lunch went badly from the start. Callum was already agitated before the food arrived, asking questions about Aveline's schedule with a specificity that felt less like interest and more like mapping. He wanted to know which nights she stayed home, which mornings she left early, whether she still reviewed company documents at her apartment on Thursdays. Aveline answered without thinking much about it, accustomed to his attention. But partway through the meal, Callum made a remark, casual offhand, meant to sound like small talk about a wire transfer processed through one of the Rourke subsidiary accounts. He named the account number. It was the kind of number that lived in internal documents on the desk of the company's head of finance and nowhere else. Aveline didn't visibly react, but something cold and quiet shifted behind her eyes. Before she could decide what to do with it, Callum's hand came across the table and covered hers with a grip that was just slightly too firm. He was making a point about the weekend, and he wanted an answer, and he didn't like being kept waiting. That was when Rowan stood up. He crossed the room in a few easy strides and stopped at the edge of their table. "Miss Rourke," he said in that same level voice he used for everything, "we need to go." Callum's face went cold. He looked at Rowan the way powerful men look at obstacles, measuring the cost of removing them. "She's in the middle of something," Callum said. Rowan looked only at Aveline. "The car is ready," he said. Aveline stood up, not because she was scared, but because the alternative was sitting there, while 2 men decided what she was going to do next, and she preferred to be the one making that call. She told Callum she'd call him later. He didn't look at her when she said it. He was still looking at Rowan. In the car, she turned on Rowan before he'd finished pulling out of the garage. "You don't get to do that," she said. "You don't get to walk into my conversations and pull me out like I'm a child." Rowan kept his eyes on the road. "He knew your account number," he said. "The subsidiary one. He had no reason to know that." Aveline felt something uncomfortable move through her chest and immediately resented it. "He's an investor. He knows a lot of numbers." Rowan said nothing, and the silence stretched until Aveline filled it the way she always did. You've been following me around for 3 weeks, second-guessing every person I talk to, making me look like I can't take care of myself in front of people who matter, she said. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you. She heard her own voice getting sharper and didn't try to soften it. I'm letting you go, effective today. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Rowan slowed for a red light, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. I'd ask you to reconsider, he said. I know this arrangement isn't what you wanted, but I need this job. He didn't say it the way people say things when they want sympathy. He said it the way people say true things. My sister is sick, leukemia. The treatment doesn't stop because I'm between contracts. The light turned green. He drove. Aveline looked out the window. The street moved past a woman walking a dog, a man carrying groceries, the world unbothered and continuing. That's not my problem, she said. And she meant it. Or she told herself she did, which is not exactly the same thing. Rowan pulled up in front of her building, got out, and opened her door without a word. She walked through the lobby without looking back. Behind her, she heard the car door close, then the engine as he drove away, and then nothing at all. She told herself she wouldn't think about him again. But at 7 that evening, stepping outside alone to get dinner, she noticed the lobby felt different. Larger. She found herself checking the corners of the restaurant without meaning to. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet and persistent, the account number Callum had named was still turning over like a question she hadn't meant to ask. Rowan told Elodie he was taking a few days off. He said it the way people say things when they've rehearsed them evenly without too much eye contact. Elodie was 11 years old and sharper than most adults he knew, but she was also tired from her latest round of treatment, so she accepted the explanation and asked him to bring back the good soup from the place on Meridian Street. He said he would. He sat with her until she fell asleep, then drove home and sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes without going inside. The contract work had carried him through most of his savings. What remained covered roughly 6 more weeks of Elodie's treatment, and after that he would need to find something new. He spent the next morning making calls, updating his resume, doing the practical things that needed doing. He did not think about Aveline Rourke. Or rather, he thought about her the way you think about something you've decided to stop thinking about, which meant he thought about her more than he would have liked. Aveline, for her part, was doing an excellent impression of a person who had no regrets. She went to lunch with a colleague, attended a board preview for her father's re-election campaign, and had dinner with Callum at a restaurant that had a 3-week waiting list. She was perfectly fine. She was completely sure of that. But 4 days after firing Rowan, she found herself in the elevator of the Hargrove Medical Center on the east side of the city, holding a visitor pass she hadn't entirely planned on acquiring. She had gone to the center to drop off a donation check on behalf of her father's charitable foundation. That was the reason she gave herself, and it was technically true. But she had known in some quiet and unacknowledged part of herself that the pediatric oncology ward was on the 4th floor, and she had known Elodie Calder was a patient there. She had seen the name on Rowan's phone screen one afternoon when he had briefly stepped away and left the device face up on the car seat, a hospital notification with the patient name visible. She had not meant to look. She had looked anyway. The girl she found in room 417 was small and bald and sitting up in bed with a book open in her lap, looking extremely unimpressed by the television mounted on the wall across from her. She had Rowan's eyes, that same still observant quality, and when Aveline appeared in the doorway, she looked up and regarded her with the kind of direct assessment that only children and very old people still allow themselves. "You're pretty," Elodie said by way of greeting. "Are you a doctor?" Aveline told her she was not. Elodie considered this and then moved over slightly on the bed, making room. "You can sit down if you want," she said. "I'm not contagious." Aveline sat. She had not planned to stay more than 5 minutes. She stayed for 2 hours. Elodie talked the way children do when they've been in a hospital long enough that adult company has stopped feeling like an event, easily, honestly, without performing. She talked about her book, about the nurse who always forgot to knock, about how the soup from the cafeteria tasted like warm water with ambitions. And she talked about her brother, not all at once, but in pieces, the way you talk about someone who is simply woven into everything. She mentioned that he slept in the chair outside her room when her fever spiked, because he didn't want to be down the hall if something happened. She mentioned that he read aloud to her every evening, even when he'd been working since 6 in the morning, even when his voice went rough by the last chapter. She mentioned with the calm practicality of someone who has had this explained to her, that the reason they couldn't have the apartment they used to have was because the money went to treatment now, and that Rowan had said it was fine because he didn't need much space. Aveline drove home that evening and did not call Callum, though he had texted twice. She sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she didn't drink and thought about a man sleeping in a hospital chair. She thought about what she had said in that car. "That's not my problem." The words had felt like armor when she said them. Now they just felt like what they were. She contacted the billing department at Hargrove Medical Center the following morning. She asked about the outstanding balance on Elodie Calder's account and arranged for it to be covered through a private charitable trust she controlled independently from her father's foundation. She requested that the source of the funding not be shared with the patient or her family. The administrator asked if she wanted a letter of acknowledgement. Aveline said no. She hung up and went back to work and told herself that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. She went back to the hospital twice more over the following weeks, always during the hours when she knew Rowan would be at work. Elodie started calling her princess, not as a compliment exactly, but as a designation, the way children assign nicknames to people who don't quite fit any existing category. Aveline brought good soup from the place on Meridian Street, because Elodie had mentioned it in passing, and she had written it down without meaning to. She did not examine any of this too carefully. In the same stretch of weeks, she also pulled the internal financial records for 3 of her father's subsidiary accounts and stayed up late going through transfer logs. The number Callum had named at lunch sat in her memory with the particular persistence of things that don't belong. What she found was not dramatic, no single transaction large enough to be immediately alarming, but the pattern was wrong. Funds moved in amounts designed to stay beneath reporting thresholds, routed through shell accounts, and re-entered as consulting fees. It had been going on for nearly 18 months. The total, when she added it up, was just under $4 million. She did not have enough to take to her father yet. She needed one more document, a payment authorization that would connect Callum's name directly to the withdrawals. She requested it through internal channels on a Thursday. On Saturday morning, she was gone. Graham Rourke had not realized anything was wrong until his daughter missed 2 calls on Sunday. He sent a car to her apartment. The driver found her door unlocked, her coffee still in the machine, her phone on the kitchen counter. By Sunday evening, a message had been sent to Graham's private number from an unregistered line with a figure and a set of instructions. He contacted the FBI. He also contacted Rowan. Rowan was in Elodie's hospital room when his phone rang with Graham's number. He looked at it for a moment, then stepped into the hallway to answer. Graham did not ease into it. He said his daughter was missing, that she had been taken, that the FBI was moving too slowly, and the deadline on the ransom was 48 hours. He said he needed Rowan, and he said it with the directness of a man who had already decided to say whatever was necessary. Rowan's voice when he answered was level and careful. He said he was no longer employed in that capacity. Graham said he understood, and then he said the ransom figure, and then neither of them said anything for a moment. Rowan said he would think about it. He went back into Elodie's room and sat down in the chair beside her bed. She was awake reading, and she looked at him with those direct eyes and said, "You look like something's wrong." He told her it was a work thing. She nodded, and then she looked back at her book, and then she looked up again. "Is it about the princess?" she asked. Rowan looked at her. "What princess?" Elodie described her the way children describe people they've decided matter. The dark hair, the green coat she wore, the second visit, the soup from the good place on Meridian Street, the way she asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She said she didn't know her real name, that the woman had never offered it. Rowan's voice was very quiet when he asked, "Did she ever say why she came?" Elodie thought about it. "No," she said. "But she looked like someone who was sorry about something." Rowan sat with that for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and called Graham Rourke back. Graham, in the hours since his first call, had learned something more. His assistant had traced the funding source for Elodie's treatment. The billing office, when pressed by a formal inquiry from the senator's office, confirmed the trust name. It was a private account Aveline had set up separately from the family foundation, but the registration paperwork still carried the Rourke family address. It had been Aveline from the very first payment, doing it quietly and asking for nothing. Graham said it the way a father says something he's ashamed it took him this long to understand about his own child. The rest came quickly. The FBI's working profile confirmed what Rowan had already suspected from the first week. The account number. The audit Aveline had mentioned at dinner. The 2 seconds Callum had gone still. Callum Voss had been moving money out of the Rourke companies for 18 months, and Aveline had gotten close enough to the evidence that he couldn't afford to let her finish. The kidnapping was not really about the ransom. The ransom was about buying time to move the funds offshore and disappear before the authorization documents surfaced. After that, there was no logical reason for Aveline to stay alive. The FBI had a perimeter around a warehouse district in the south end of the city. They had a negotiator on a call going nowhere, and a deadline everyone in the room knew Callum had no intention of honoring. What they did not have was someone who knew how to move through a building in the dark, who had done it before under conditions considerably worse than this, and who had a reason that went beyond professional obligation. Rowan stood outside the command vehicle in the gray early morning and looked at the building 2 blocks away, long, concrete-boarded windows, and along the western face 3 access points the tactical team hadn't yet mapped. He checked his watch. Then he moved toward the western side. The western access point was a rusted service door chained from the inside, which told Rowan 2 things: someone had gone in that way recently, and they hadn't expected anyone to follow. The chain was a standard hardware store padlock. He was through it in 5 seconds and moving into the dark interior before the door had finished swinging closed behind him. The warehouse was larger inside than the exterior suggested, a long central floor, divided by rows of old shelving units, with a mezzanine level running along the eastern wall, and a cluster of enclosed rooms in the far corner that had once been offices. The light was low and uneven, coming from work lamps set up near the office cluster. Rowan could hear voices from that direction, at least 2 men moving between the lamps and the shelving, and further in, behind a closed door, the sound of something being dragged across concrete. He moved along the western wall, staying below the sightline of the mezzanine, and took his time. The first guard was positioned at the end of the central shelving row, with his back to the wall, and his attention on his phone. Rowan came up on his left side and had him down before the phone hit the floor. He caught the phone, set it face down on the shelf, and kept moving. The second guard was closer to the office cluster, pacing a short loop between 2 fixed points. Rowan watched the pattern for 90 seconds, waited for the far point of the loop, and moved. 2 down. The voices from the mezzanine had not changed tempo. Nobody had heard anything. The door to the back office was not locked, just pulled shut. Rowan stood beside it and listened for 30 seconds before touching the handle. 1 voice inside. Callum's, though he'd never heard him speak without the social performance layered over it. Without that, the voice was flatter and less patient. He was on a call reading account numbers in a low and careful tone. He was already moving the money. The 48-hour deadline was theater. Rowan opened the door. The room was roughly 12 feet square, lit by a single work lamp on a folding table where a laptop sat open. Callum stood with his back to the door and his phone to his ear. In the far corner, zip-tied to a metal chair with her wrists behind her and a cut above her left eyebrow that had dried dark against her skin, was Aveline. She was watching the door when it opened. Her eyes found Rowan, and something moved through her face, not relief exactly, because relief is soft. And what crossed her face in that moment was more complicated than that. It was the expression of someone who had been holding themselves together through will alone and had just seen a reason to keep doing it. Callum heard the door and turned. For 1 second, the three of them were perfectly still. Then Callum ended the call, set the phone on the table beside the laptop, and looked at Rowan with the careful expression of a man recalculating. "You're not FBI," Callum said. "No," Rowan agreed. Callum looked at the door behind him, doing the math on his guards, and then looked back. "How many of my guys are still upright?" he asked. "None of the ones I passed," Rowan said, and let that land without elaboration. Rowan moved toward Aveline. Callum moved at the same moment, not toward the door, but sideways, putting himself between Rowan and the chair, and when his hand came up, it had a gun in it. The gun was not shaking. Callum had the steadiness of someone who had convinced himself he was out of options, which made him more dangerous than someone who was simply angry. "The money's already moving," Callum said. "You can't stop that. So the only question's what happens next." He looked at Aveline as he said it, and the look was not the look of someone who planned to leave a witness. Rowan kept his voice at a conversational register. "What happens next," he said, "is you put the gun down. Because the FBI has this building surrounded, and the only thing walking out of here on your behalf is a cooperation agreement, and that only exists if she walks out alive." It was partly true. The FBI did have a perimeter. Whether they'd breach in time was a separate question Rowan did not have a clear answer to. But the goal was not to be accurate. The goal was to hold Callum's attention on him and away from Aveline for long enough. It worked for about 40 seconds. Callum was watching Rowan, reading him, trying to find the angle. In the corner, Aveline had gotten her feet under her. The zip tie on her wrists was fixed to the back of the chair, not to itself, which meant the chair moved when she moved. She looked at the laptop on the table, still open, the transfer window still active, and she looked at the work lamp beside it, and she made a decision with the focused practicality of someone who has stopped waiting to be rescued. She stood up fast, taking the chair with her, and drove her shoulder into the folding table. The laptop went sideways. The work lamp went with it and hit the floor, pulling the light down with it. The room dropped into dark. Callum spun toward the sound, and Rowan closed the distance in 2 strides and had Callum's wrist before the gun could find a new target. What followed was brief and not graceful, but decisive. By the time the work lamp flickered back on where it had rolled against the wall, Callum was face down on the concrete, and Rowan had the gun. Outside, the sound of the outer doors coming open all at once meant the FBI had heard enough. Rowan crossed to Aveline and looked at the cut above her eyebrow first, then at her eyes, checking focus. She was steady. Her breathing was controlled in the way that people control their breathing when they are frightened and refusing to show it. He worked the zip tie loose, and when her hands came free, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "The laptop. The transfer, he was moving the money offshore." Rowan picked the laptop up off the floor and handed it to the first FBI agent through the door without being asked. Then he stepped back and let them work. Aveline sat on the edge of the overturned table, with agents moving around her, and Callum being pulled to his feet somewhere behind her, and she looked at Rowan. "I'm sorry," she said. It was not the elaborate apology she had probably rehearsed in her head during the hours she'd spent alone in that chair. It was just the 2 words said directly without preamble. Rowan looked at her for a moment. "The cut needs to be looked at," he said. "Apologize later." She almost laughed. It came out as something less than a laugh and more than a breath, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second before she got it under control. "Okay," she said. Later, Graham Rourke arrived at the debrief location 40 minutes after the building was cleared and held his daughter for a long time without speaking. When he finally let go, he turned to Rowan and named a figure, the kind of number that would have solved every problem Rowan currently had for the next several years. Rowan said he appreciated it. Then he said no. Graham looked at him steadily. "You could at least pretend to think about it," he said. "I didn't do it for money," Rowan said. "I know that," Graham said. "That's exactly why I'm offering it." Rowan shook his head once, and Graham, who had not become a senator by failing to read people, let it go. 3 days later, Aveline called her father from her apartment and asked him to reinstate Rowan's contract. Graham said he had already made the call the morning after the warehouse. "I was waiting to see if you'd ask," he said, "or if you'd pretend it was a purely professional decision." Aveline told him to stop being perceptive and hung up. Rowan came back on a Thursday. He showed up at the usual time, stood in the usual spot in the lobby, and when Aveline came down and found him there, they looked at each other with the specific awkwardness of two people who know something has changed, but haven't agreed yet on what to call it. "Same rules?" Rowan asked. Aveline considered that. "Some of the rules," she said. He nodded once as though that was a reasonable answer, and she decided it probably was. The thing nobody had told Aveline about letting someone actually matter to you was how much space they took up in the ordinary parts of the day. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was Rowan handing her coffee she hadn't asked for, but apparently always wanted at that exact time. It was the way he waited by the car every morning without making it look like waiting. It was the conversation that started in the elevator and continued in the lobby and didn't really end, just got picked up the next day as though there had been no gap. The armor she'd worn so consistently that she'd forgotten it was armor started to feel less necessary around him. She wasn't sure when that happened. She suspected it had been happening for a long time. She was in Elodie's hospital room on a Wednesday afternoon in early December. Elodie's latest scan had come back with enough good news that the attending physician had used the word encouraging for the first time when Rowan came in and found them playing cards. Elodie looked up and said without any setup, "She lets me win." Rowan looked at Aveline. Aveline said, "That is completely untrue." Elodie laid down her cards, a clean win, and smiled the particular smile of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Rowan sat down on the other side of the bed and looked at his sister's face, which had a different quality to it than it had 2 months ago. Less exhausted, less gray at the edges. The treatment was working. It had been working since the funding came through, since someone who owed him nothing had walked into a hospital and quietly arranged things and refused to take credit for it. He had not said anything to Aveline about this directly. There were things between them that kept not getting said in the daytime, because the daytime was always full of something else. It was Elodie who fell asleep first, her body still governed by the rhythm of treatment and rest. Aveline tucked the blanket up and turned off the television, and then she and Rowan sat in the 2 chairs on either side of the room in the low light and the quiet. After a while, Rowan said, "I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm only feeling it because of Elodie." Aveline looked at him. "Then say it the way it is, Phone," she said. He looked at his sister sleeping. "I think I already loved you before I knew what you'd done," he said. "And then I found out, and it became something I didn't have a word for anymore." Aveline was quiet for a moment. "I was awful to you," she said. Rowan said, "Yes." She said, "I meant what I said in the car. At the time I meant it." He said, "I know." He said it without resentment, and that absence of resentment was harder for her to sit with than anger would have been. "I'm still sorry," she said. "I know that too," he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the arm of her chair. A ring, small, plain gold, old in an honest way. "It was my mother's," he said. "I'm not doing this in a restaurant. I'm not doing a speech. I just want to know if you want to stay." Aveline looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she picked it up and put it on, and she looked at him across that small room, with Elodie sleeping between them, and she said, "I'm staying." Rowan didn't smile right away. He just looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, steadily, without performance. And then something in his expression settled into something that had no adequate word for it either. Outside the window, the city moved through its evening, indifferent and continuing. And inside that small room, with its low light, and its quiet 3 people who had arrived in each other's lives sideways, and impractically had become, without entirely planning it, a family. Rowan didn't save Evelyn because it was his job. He saved her because she had already shown him who she really was, not in the boardrooms, not in the lobbies, but in a quiet hospital room on the 4th floor where nobody was watching and there was nothing to gain. And Evelyn didn't fall in love with a bodyguard. She fell in love with a man who saw her clearly, held his ground, and came back anyway. The real lesson this story leaves behind is a simple one. The way you treat people when you have all the power says everything about who you are. And sometimes the person you dismissed as beneath you is the only one with enough character to walk back through the door after you've closed it in their face. If that's the kind of story that stays with you, the ones about people who earn each other slowly, honestly, and without pretense, then subscribe, because there are more where this came from. Leave a comment with a character you'd want to see next, and we'll see you in the next one.